You're listening to Things You Should Know, and I'm your host, Andy Ngo. In this episode, I interview Professor Eric Kaufmann again. He's a scholar of political demography at Birkbeck College in the University of London. I first interviewed him last year about his research on secularism and religious demography. In this episode, we talk about whiteness and its relationship to populism. These are subjects he explores in his new book, Whiteshift: Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. It is such a privilege to be able to be speaking with you because you're one of the very few political scientists that I know of who does research into white nationalism, white identity, without using critical race theory as theoretical frameworks. I wanted to start with a defining of terms that I hear a lot in mainstream pop culture discourses. And what is white nationalism?
White nationalism would be essentially the argument that the nation, which is the political territorial unit, should be dominated by, or even exclusively, by the white majority ethnic group.
How is white defined by people who are adherents of this ideology?
Well, in the US, which I think is where the term makes the most sense, it's that white is the ethnic majority group, which is essentially a group that's been created through the intermarriage of different European groups. Now, some on the far right, white nationalists would tend to exclude Jews, for example, from that white category. That's maybe the difference from the way white might be used by the average American, which would tend to include the Jews. So essentially what they're talking about is non-Hispanic white Christians as an entity. And which is an entity in a way because of all the intermarriage, although there may be some people who have a singular ethnic identity and would still be part of that. So that's kind of how whiteness would be defined in this case.
In academia as well as in media, white nationalism and white supremacy is usually used interchangeably. But as far as I understand, there actually is a meaningful distinction, is there not?
There is a distinction. I mean, you could have a white nationalist who is a white supremacist, and you could have a white nationalist who is not. You could have a white supremacist who is not a white nationalist. So I'll give you an example from American history. During the Civil War, the northern states adhered to what I would call white nationalism, and that is to say, they envisioned the U.S. as a white country, and they hoped that the African American population after the war would go back to Africa. So that was the origins of the colonization movement. That view is essentially to say that kind of free soil philosophy was that we want to be a country, we want to be a white country. Now you go to the southern states in the Confederacy, and their ideology was, no, we want the African Americans here. We don't want to send them back to Africa. We want to enslave them. And so whites will be superior in this social system. So the belief there is in white supremacy, but actually the way they envision the country was perhaps less of a sort of homogenous white space than the northern view. So actually you have white nationalism in the north, white supremacy in the south. And of course there's no doubt that the northerners also believed that whites were supreme compared to other races, and the southerners probably had a concept of the nation that excluded African Americans. So, I mean, this is a sort of fuzzy kind of boundary, but it's a way of thinking about what might be a distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism.
I asked Professor Kaufmann to tell me what his new book, Whiteshift, is about.
Well, it's essentially about saying we need a conversation about white identity, and we need a conversation in Western countries, and that the white group is not, as critical race theory would have it, an elite construction designed to maximize political and economic benefits to a set of individuals. So it's not a sort of shifting, almost not cynical, but instrumental construct, But actually, I would see it as more of an ethnic group like any other, which is that it's maintained not for political and economic reasons, but for cultural reasons. That is, people are attached to particular myths, symbols, and historical narratives and want to reproduce those into subsequent generations. And so that, in that sense, it's no different, let's say, from a Chinese identity or an African American identity. And so I want to look at this white identity in a realistic, data-based way and to say, well, where is it going? Because ultimately, I think the populism that we're seeing in Europe and in the United States as well stems ultimately from the malaise and the condition of this ethnic group as it enters a period of relative decline demographically. So how does that group then think of its future and draw a line back to the past? Those kind of existential questions are, in my view, and I think I can show this in the data very clearly, that's what's driving the kind of politics that we're seeing.
It's my understanding that by the end of this century, some Western countries are projected to have a white minority for the first time. Is that correct?
Yes,
Which
that's
countries?
true. So roughly around the middle of this century, the US, Canada, and New Zealand will all be somewhere around the 50% white mark. By the end of the century, Western Europe, many countries in Western Europe will probably be there as well. I mean, that'll be towards the end of the century.
And this is being driven by birth rates and immigration?
Yes. So it's the fact that there's below replacement fertility amongst white groups in all Western countries, which is not particularly surprising since that's the whole population in all Western countries. And so you're getting immigration. And depending on how we want to handle intermarriage also, if you count the offspring of intermarriages as not being white, then that too is adding to the decline of the white population.
What are some of the responses you can see in polling data today to these demographic shifts?
Well, what I'm sort of thinking, in this book is that sense of decline makes the majority of the white population, not everybody, because there's a significant liberal chunk within the white population, but it makes people more existentially anxious about their group's future, and therefore immigration becomes a lightning rod for politics. So your attitudes to immigration are, the key to, if we want to explain support for populist right parties, supporters of populist right parties are almost exclusively people who want much lower immigration. Immigration is the best predictor of support for a populist right party. Now, there are many people in Europe and the US, Europe, let's say, who are anti-immigration who don't vote for populists. So the pool of people who are anti-immigration is larger than the pool of people who vote for the populist right. But essentially, they are fishing in that pond. They're not fishing in the pond of people who are pro-immigration. And so, and if we ask about the drivers of immigration sentiment, then the research on that, the academic research on that, shows that this is not driven by people fearing for their jobs, having lost their livelihoods, etc. It's not a material thing. It's largely to do with your views on national identity. It's largely to do with psychological factors based on if you're the kind of person who prefers order, security, and routine, then you are more likely to vote populist right. Whereas if you're the kind of person who is into change, exploration, benevolence, and so on, then you are much less likely to. So these sort of underlying psychological profiles are what correlate best to immigration sentiment, and immigration sentiment is what underpins populist right vote. So it's not, the populist right voting has almost nothing to do with, deindustrialization and economic transformation, or even resentment of elites, full stop. I mean, that people on the left are as resentful of elites as voters for the populist right. So that isn't really the way you're going to pick out a populist right voter from somebody else.
Taking a nuanced and impassionate perspective and research into this topic, is something I actually don't see at all, because it's white identity, the interests of white groups is very unpalatable. And I think here I should probably set the context for your own multicultural and multiracial background, as well as my non-white background, just to contextualize this. Ideally, those type of characteristics should be irrelevant, but I think it might be helpful in setting the record straight on who we are and why we're talking about this. But what made you decide to research this area that could have potentially political, social, and academic consequences?
Right. Well, yeah, I've always been interested. Why? I mean, as you say, my own biography. First of all, I got interested in nations and national identities because I was born abroad. I was born in Hong Kong. I lived 8 years of my life in Japan, early years. You may not have known that, actually, but yeah. So I've grown up around the world, and so that makes you more aware of your national identity. And then, being, as you say, of a multi-ethnic background, a quarter Chinese, quarter Latino, half Jewish, and so, but essentially in a North American context. I grew up in Vancouver. Now, most of my classmates in school would have been of Anglo-Protestant background, but essentially being somebody who more or less looks white, but has this multiracial background, whose mother doesn't look white. So I'm kind of aware of both sides of the equation. I think that I'm aware of kind of what it means to be different a bit, and also the majority perspective a little bit. In Vancouver, which of course as a city has undergone a massive ethnic transformation since the 1970s. So it's gone from essentially being, essentially an all-white, not all white, but over 90% white city to, now about 50%. It's a similar transformation that a lot of cities in the West have undergone, although Vancouver, I think, has probably been one of the faster ones. So all of those things, I guess, just awaken this set of interests.
How does the alt-right in the North American context and the Identity Europa in the European context fit into your research, if at all?
Well, my research, and certainly for the book, has been mainly looking at the populist right electorally and looking at attitudes to immigration and the increasing importance of immigration. But I would say this is very relevant, these groups, alt-right and Identity Europa, in the sense that they fit the profile of people who are attached to their identity, their ethnic identity, right? So ethnicity is about ancestry and tradition and myths and symbols that often connect a group to what it perceives of as an ethnic homeland. So that, if you think about that definition of ethnicity, I think these are ethnic movements. And so they are looking at the decline of their group, and they are, obviously trying to resist that. Now, clearly their view of the ethnic majority is an exclusivist one, so that they would be against interracial marriage, for example. And so I think that, but they would very definitely fit what I'm interested in, which is this idea of how does the white majority negotiate this ethnic change. And then Identity Europa would be one response to that, which would be to say, we're being replaced, we've got to do something about this, we've got to shut the borders, probably repatriate a bunch of people. That would be their kind of general worldview. So it would just be at the extreme end of a kind of white nationalism, or which is a sort of ethnic nationalism.
In your book, do you address any of the arguments that I guess I would call it the progressive left social justice movement, in their opposition to white identity, saying that any attempt to preserve or even have these conversations is white supremacy, racist? Is there merit in that?
I don't think there is. I mean, I draw a clear distinction between antipathy to outgroups, so hatred or fear of outgroups, and attachment to an in-group. And we know from the psychology literature now for 60 years or so that actually those two orientations are not correlated except in situations of violent ethnic conflict. So I think what's often happening here is that you have, there's going to be a mixture of motives. I mean, there are some people who are hating out groups, and this is where I'm sort of more critical of some of the anti-Islam stuff in the sense that it's stigmatizing an out group. Whereas if it's about attachment to an in-group, then I think that's actually, this is something that we see amongst minorities and amongst majorities. And I think drawing a double standard to say that, if you're a Chinese American, you can express your culture, you may even defend your interests, let's say, around affirmative action. Whereas if you're white, you can neither express your culture nor defend your interests. I think that is highly problematic. And actually, Coleman Hughes, an African-American scholar who I don't know if you met, who was at the Heterodox Academy conference and has written a number of very sharp pieces on this. A number of writers, including, but especially Coleman Hughes, talking about this double standard and saying there's really no theoretical or principled justification for it. And I very much would agree with that. I don't think you can invoke, quote unquote history as a trump card. Well, because the structures of oppression which existed in the past don't necessarily continue into the present. So if, for example, whites were organizing as a cartel to oppress minorities and African Americans, then you could legitimately say the more we can weaken white identity, the more we weaken their ability to get together and oppress. So then the argument would make sense that, yes, white identity is a problem because it enables this oppressive structure to reproduce itself. But the evidence for that kind of group collusion maintaining an oppressive structure is extremely weak now, weak to non-existent. And so I don't think that rationale holds water. It's a bit like saying Protestants are colluding to oppress Catholics in the United States because that was in the DNA of the American Republic. Now, it was in the DNA of the American Republic, and that's exactly what the Protestants did for, the better part of 200 years, but that oppressive structure is no longer there, right? So I think, and I would argue that largely the same is true for this white oppressive structure. So I don't see much downside to allowing this group to express its identity. What I would say, however, is that expression should be done in a kind of rational, moderate, open, liberal way. I mean, that's how I would qualify that. But I would apply the same standard to also minority groups. So I think that I would like to see a sort of level playing field on this.
Certainly, when you compare the historical developments of white nationalist movements with, for example, black nationalist movements, the history and context is so different that it makes it very hard for a lot of people to see it as two sides of the same coin, that they cannot really be equated on principle because of the history. Is that an argument that you think has a little bit of merit, at least?
Well, I would always say that you have to prove the continuation of a structure. So if there is a structure of oppression that is orchestrated by whites, then that needs to be empirically shown, measured and empirically
white
shown.
Privilege? How about that?
There is white privilege. Now, you can have white privilege that is not orchestrated by whites. So, for example, and so there can be, for example, in hiring, we know in these resume studies, which are the only real rigorous way to test this, that if you have a clearly, Muslim-sounding name or a stereotypically African-American sounding first name, then you will get fewer callbacks, that is, those studies are out there, and you can see that. Now, the problem is, and you can also see that, African-Americans are more likely to be shot by police. Now, of course, once you control for a number of other factors, that is much, much, much less the case. But it may still be the case. But what we also say is that there aren't any studies showing that Hispanic and Asian recruiters are less likely to discriminate against African Americans than whites. We haven't seen studies that say African American police officers are less likely to shoot black suspects than whites. So what it is you've got a structure that is maintained by all groups that happens to have negative consequences for, say, African Americans in hiring or in the justice system, or Muslims in hiring The point being that this is not a white orchestrated system. It is a complex system in which all groups are participating in this system. So whether the white group expresses its identity culturally or not is utterly orthogonal to this. You could take every white person out of America and the system would continue to operate exactly as it is now. So it's not, what I mean is it's not actually a white orchestrated system. And so again, I think weakening white identity will do absolutely nothing to address the problem of white privilege.
Do you anticipate strong backlash to your book and your argument? Because even though I perceive you to be racially ambiguous, but other people might not be as charitable and say that you look as white passing and therefore you are trying to uphold a certain status quo of white supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I anticipate two groups will be really annoyed with me. One is going to be, as you say, the cultural left, and the other is going to be the far right, because there's I talk quite a bit about race mixing as a positive thing in the book. But yeah, I think there are going to be people who are going to be, who are going to kind of attribute negative motives, because this confusion, I think, in the minds of a lot of people who are into the critical race thing, where they more or less collapse white privilege and white identity into the same construct. And that, I think I can sort of see how one might do that, because it's not easy to see how white privilege is actually a emergent property of a complex set of interactions between many groups. It's not something that is orchestrated by whites for whites. It's not like an apartheid system. And that's can be a hard concept to grasp. This idea that is something different from white identity, and sort of punishing whites and saying you can't have an identity is actually not in any way related to the kind of political economic white privilege. And if anything, what it does is it annoys whites who see the double standard and who are then going to vote accordingly and express that frustration. So I kind of think, actually, if we want to address what remains of white privilege, you actually have to do it with the assistance of whites, and you're not going to get there by kind of banning their identity. So I don't think this is something that goes against the ultimate aims of the left, actually, but it does go against a very simplistic, what John McWhorter would call the religion of anti-racism, where you set up this white male bogeyman as the kind of other, and then you sort of develop a whole belief system around that. I think that is a major impediment to addressing some of these very difficult issues.
In my nascent career in interviewing and speaking with identified white nationalists, without exception, all of them have pointed to their so-called awakening to the anti-white rhetoric that they see in pop culture, in mainstream society, and mostly as well in the universities. Is there data to support this claim from what you've seen?
Data to support the claim that white nationalists believe that, or that is a reality?
That these anti-racist campaigns and ideologies actually fuel stronger white identity.
I would say there is evidence for that. So there have been a number of experimental studies that take two passages. It might be about Donald Trump's policies, or it might be about the Confederate flag, or it might be about affirmative action or whatever. And one set of wording just talks about the policy. Another passage talks about the policy and says, and this should be opposed because, say, Trump is a racist, or Confederate flags are racist, or use of that term racist in the second paragraph to a second group of people. So you have each group of people in this experiment read a different paragraph. And the ones who read the paragraph which use the term racist see a heightened support for things like Confederate flag, Donald Trump, etc., amongst certain whites. So certain whites, when they see that word, that acts as a red flag and actually increases support for some of these radical policies. So I think that there is definitely, I think there is now a growing body of evidence that would suggest that when you attempt to wag the finger and accuse people of racism, that gets their backs up. Not everybody. It seems to work. It seems to be only a subsection of the white population that has that activating effect on. But it's definitely a negative effect, because there's no part of the population that when you use the term racist becomes more tolerant and less willing to support a policy like Confederate flags or so on. So using that term actually is very counterproductive.
What is the main thesis of your book?
Well, the main thesis of the book really, it's twofold. It's really all about the process of white majorities in an age of ethnic transformation. And in the first stage, there's this insecurity which leads to receptivity to right-wing populism and leads to polarization, because the part of the white population which is interested in change and cosmopolitanism and is not interested in maintenance of culture and tradition actually then turns against the part of the population that is into ethnic defense. And that leads to a bifurcation and splitting within the white population. Most whites are on the more defensive end, but you have a significant chunk of more liberal whites. Now, my book ultimately says this is only going to be resolved through a process I call Whiteshift, which is where the white population effectively, because of voluntary assimilation into intermarriage, which is going to be very pronounced as we approach the end of our century. So it's not going to happen in our lifetime, but towards the end of our century, that dynamic is really going to take off, and we're going to see a lot more melting. And once that occurs, what I'm arguing is I think that the offspring, people from this mixed background will essentially identify more with their European heritage. If we're talking about Europe, in the United States, it could become a mix of the European and African heritage, but essentially that European heritage will remain central to the identity of these new majorities that are going to emerge out of this melting process. And that's kind of why this whole idea of white shift is really about the shift from a kind of unmixed to a mixed white majority population.
What's your response to a lot of these social justice excesses, I guess I would call, that take aim to, I'm using their language, deconstruct whiteness? Sometimes some of them go as far as to say that whiteness is the greatest force for evil in the world, in the history of the world. I've seen that white DNA is an abomination. Do you think that these campaigns are, I don't know if I'll call it campaigns, maybe just more broadly an ideology, do you think they will actually achieve the goals they seek of creating a egalitarian, anti-racist society?
No, I think actually quite the reverse. I think that actually the motivation that's sustaining them is less some sort of rational policy goal of trying to eliminate racial inequality than, as John McWhorter would say, this is a religion. That is to say, there are totemic groups, say people of color, and there are outgroups, white males, let's say. There are concepts of original sin, so whiteness as a stain is original sin that you must repent for, and that essentially this is a sinful thing, and the only thing you can really do as a white person is to try and then bring forth this, what I call a multicultural millennium, which is this idea of a new cultural state, which is this sort of utopian state where you won't have any racism, racial oppression, etc. So it's not I don't think this is sort of an objective, rational, evidence-based viewpoint. This is kind of a millenarian religious experience in which you have sort of certain sacred values, anti-racism, let's say. And I think it is counterproductive because, as you say, I mean, this is what kind of people see this. The ordinary person sees this, say the ordinary white person sees this, and they think we're being attacked. People are essentially attacking my group, which is kind of true. because it is more or less true, and that's only going to make it harder to get buy-in for progressive policies, let's say, which might have a much larger effect in ameliorating racial differences in racial group outcomes. But I actually would say that it has that sort of religion of anti-racism has deeper roots than some analysts would say. I think we can see echoes of this going back 100 years. I mean, faint echoes, but certainly in some of the writings of what are called the lyrical left or the bohemian left in the 1910s, we can see this kind of talk, sort of denigrating of one's own group, a kind of adversary culture where WASP intellectuals were critical of Anglo-Protestants as a group of Protestant culture, and with some justification. Obviously, prohibition of alcohol was something that hurt them in their lifestyle, and it was something that emerges out of this Anglo-Protestant culture. But that's kind of really the beginning of this sort of turning against one's own group and seeing it as retrograde. And then that kind of, as we move through the 1960s, that then takes on more of a racial inflection, becomes perhaps more moralistic. And so it's a powerful historical force. I don't doubt its power, but I don't think it's kind of something that is kind of good for the world.
And lastly, are you hopeful about the future in terms of racial harmony, racial cohesion in our multiracial societies, or do you think that we're moving in a darker direction?
Well, I think I'm reasonably hopeful in the sense that, your average, the average person, for example, doesn't hold the extreme doctrinaire views. So the anti-whiteness is something that is largely a product of a very rarefied campus culture. The average minority doesn't bear this kind of animus, and I do think that and you see encouraging signs. So, for example, things like Heterodox Academy, there's starting to be some pushback against the anti-white social justice ideology, and increasingly black writers, people like Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter, are starting to speak up and to say, well, actually, we have to question, this kind of victimizer-victim paradigm. And so I do think from both minority writers and from white writers, there's kind of a growing realization that that's sort of a dead end, and I don't think it has broad public support. So I think there will be a kind of correction in a way to some of the dominant direction of travel has been in that enforcing the oppressor-oppressed paradigm, but I actually think that's starting to meet resistance, and I think also concerns around immigration are starting to percolate. The mainstream parties are starting to take that on board, which I think will take away real estate from the populist right, in Europe anyway.
And that was Professor Eric Kaufmann. If you enjoy my work, please consider becoming a supporter through Subscribestar, Patreon, or PayPal. As an independent journalist, this work is only possible through your support. Even a few dollars a month helps me a lot. You can find the links in the description.